All right, so get this. The book we're diving into today is called Cutting Hair Off the Cow.
Yeah, that's a weird one, right?
It is, but you know how we roll. We go deep on these deep dives.
Absolutely. So we're going to be looking at recognizing God's voice.
Exactly, and all these like wild examples they use to, to show how to activate your faith.
Right, how to tap into that kingdom power.
Kingdom power. Yes, that's it. So like Noah building the ark when it's never even rained before, right? That's
Yeah.
in there.
Oh yeah, definitely. And remember how David took down Goliath?
Oh, yeah, he was just a shepherd.
Just a shepherd, exactly. And the book uses all these examples to show like God doesn't always play by our rules.
It's like he's got this whole other playbook going
Yeah,
on.
exactly. He's operating on a different level, and sometimes it just doesn't make sense to us.
So this cutting hair off the cow thing, it's all about how God's instructions can sometimes seem, I don't know, kind of crazy.
It's brilliant though because it makes you think, right? Like why would you cut hair off a cow?
It's true. What good could possibly come from that?
And that's the point, right? It's that sometimes God's wisdom is so far beyond our understanding that it just seems completely absurd.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So it's like a challenge to our assumptions, right?
Totally. Yeah, like we think we know what's best, but really we have no idea what God's got up his sleeve.
And the book goes into a bunch of these crazy examples from the Bible.
Yeah, one that really stood out to me was the story of Hosea.
Hosea,
Yeah.
the prophet.
Yeah, God told him to marry a prostitute.
Whoa, okay, that's a tough one.
It's like, what? That's crazy, but there's a deeper meaning there,
Well,
right?
that's like a PR stunt for God's love or something.
It's more about God showing his unconditional love for his people, even when they're, messing up big time.
Even when they're straying. Yeah, got it.
So it's like what seems totally messed up to us is actually part of God's bigger plan.
I see, but wasn't that like really hard on Hosea?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the gossip.
Right, everyone talking.
Yeah, but the book makes it clear that following God's instructions isn't always easy.
Sometimes it's downright painful.
Yeah, but there's always a purpose, even if we don't understand it at the time.
Okay, so what other crazy instructions does the book talk about?
Well, there's Joseph. His own brothers sold him into slavery.
Oh, yeah, and then he was falsely accused and thrown in prison.
Yeah, but he ends up saving a whole nation from starvation.
It's like those hardships. They actually prepared him for greatness.
Exactly, and that's something we can all learn from, right? Like sometimes what we see as setbacks are actually God's way of getting us ready for something amazing.
So the rough times, it might actually be a good thing in the long run.
Could be, yeah. It's about trusting that God has a plan, even when we're going through hell.
But how do we know if something's like a God thing or just, life being life?
That's the question, isn't it? The book talks a lot about discernment.
Discernment, yeah.
Yeah.
So figuring out if it's actually God's voice we're hearing.
We're going to dive deeper into that later on, but for now, I think it's about having that foundational trust in God.
Okay, trusting even when things are super tough.
Even when it seems like everything's falling apart.
Got it. So sometimes hardship can be a sign that God's working behind the scenes.
That he's using those tough times to mold us and shape us.
What other crazy instructions are in the book?
Well, there's Samson.
Samson, strong
No.
guy.
Yeah, the one with the super strength.
Okay, what did he do?
Well, he was facing this whole Philistine army,
Whoa, that's a lot of dudes.
and God told him to use a donkey's jawbone as a weapon.
A donkey's jawbone. Seriously?
It sounds ridiculous.
That's nuts.
But he ended up defeating 1,000 men with it.
Wait, 1,000? With a jawbone?
1,000? It's crazy, right?
That's insane. It's like God saying, I don't need your fancy weapons. I can use anything.
Yeah, he's all about using the weak things to shame the strong.
Like he's flipping the script on us.
Totally. And it's a good reminder that we need to let go of our own ideas about how things should be done.
Surrender to his will, even if it seems totally bonkers.
Exactly, because his ways are higher than our ways.
Like that verse from Isaiah, right?
My thoughts are not your thoughts.
Neither are your ways my ways.
That's it. It's like we need to stop trying to fit God into our tiny little boxes.
So much bigger than that.
So much bigger, yeah. And his ways are so much higher.
Okay, so we're seeing how following God's crazy instructions often means stepping outside of our comfort zones.
Definitely. And doing things that might seem totally illogical to the world.
But the book also talks about how it's not about our ability, but our availability.
Right. God's not looking for the most talented or the most skilled.
It's more about our willingness to be used by him,
It's like saying, here I am, Lord, send me.
even if we feel totally unqualified.
Yeah, even if we think we're not good enough.
And the book uses the story of David and Goliath to illustrate this.
Yeah, David was just a shepherd boy. He had no business fighting a giant.
But he had faith, and that made all the difference.
That's it. His faith gave him the courage to step onto that battlefield.
And ultimately, it was God's power working through him that brought down Goliath.
It's a powerful reminder that we don't have to be perfect to be used by God.
We just have to be willing,
Available and willing, that's all he asks.
which means anyone can be a David in their own way.
Exactly. We all have unique gifts and talents that God can use.
But it all starts with saying yes to him,
Yes to his will. Yes to his plan, even if it seems crazy.
even if it means cutting hair off the cow.
Especially if it means cutting hair off the cow.
So if you're feeling inadequate or unqualified for something, God might be calling you to.
Remember, it's not about your ability, but your availability.
God can equip you with everything you need.
He's got your back.
All you have to do is trust him and take that step of faith.
And be ready for the adventure of a lifetime.
Because when you partner with God...
Nothing is impossible.
All right, so we've seen how this concept of cutting hair off the cow ties into stepping out in faith.
Even when it doesn't make sense.
But how do we cultivate that kind of faith that can move mountains?
That's a great question. And it's something we'll dive into in part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
So we were talking about that feeling, like when you know you're supposed to do something.
Yeah, but it just seems impossible.
Right. Like way out of reach.
Totally. And the book's saying it's all about faith.
Exactly. But it's not just about believing. It's about trusting God's promises.
So, like, actually doing something about it.
That's it. Taking action.
Okay, so it's not enough to just say, I believe.
Nope. You got to put your faith into action.
Got it. So every time we do that, even if it's something small,
You're building up your faith muscles.
like getting stronger.
Stronger, exactly. And the book talks about this whole idea of activating faith.
Activating, okay, so it's like turning something on.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
So how do we do that? How do we actually activate our faith?
Well, the book goes back to the story of David and Goliath.
Right, little David versus the giant.
Exactly. And it wasn't David's size or strength that won the battle.
It was his faith in God.
Exactly. His unwavering belief in God's power.
Okay, but David still had to go out there and face Goliath, right?
You got it. Faith without action is kind of pointless.
It's like a car without an engine.
Exactly. It might look good, but it won't get you anywhere.
So David's faith was what fueled his actions.
Gave him that courage to step onto the battlefield.
So how do we make that jump, from believing to actually doing?
Well, the book dives into this whole concept of renewing our minds.
Renewing, like getting rid of the old stuff.
Yeah, kind of. It's about aligning our thoughts with God's truth.
Okay, so it's like what we think about God affects how much we can tap into his power.
That's it. Our thoughts can either limit us or empower us.
It's like if we're constantly focusing on our doubts and fears,
It's like trying to fill a swimming pool with a tiny little straw.
but if we renew our minds with God's truth,
Then it's like opening up the floodgates.
letting all that power flow in.
Exactly. And the book talks about this thing called the law of first truth.
Okay, what's that?
It's basically the idea that the first thing we learn about something shapes how we see it from then on.
So, like, if our first impression of God is wrong,
Then it's going to mess up everything else.
I see. So we need to make sure our beliefs about God are accurate.
That they line up with what the Bible says.
So how do we do that? How do we renew our minds?
Well, the book talks about the importance of immersing ourselves in God's word.
So reading the Bible,
Yeah, it's like a mental detox.
getting rid of all the junk.
And replacing it with God's truth.
So the more we read the Bible, the more our thinking changes.
Exactly. And
Okay.
the more we start to see things from God's perspective.
Okay, so renewing our minds is a big part of activating faith.
What else, you ask?
What else?
Well, the book talks about choosing faith over fear.
Right, because fear can really hold us back.
It can paralyze us, keep us from doing what God's calling us to do.
But how do we do that? How do we choose faith when we're terrified?
It's not easy, but the book reminds us that God hasn't given us a spirit of fear.
He's given us a spirit of power and love.
And a sound mind? Yeah, so when fear comes knocking,
We got to remind ourselves who God is.
and what he's capable of doing.
So it's about shifting our focus
From the problem to the solution?
from the what ifs to the God cans.
That's good, I like
It
that.
reminds me of what the book says about the kingdom of God.
How it can override natural laws,
Like we're stepping into a different reality.
where the impossible becomes possible,
It's like those superhero movies.
where they defy gravity and stuff.
Exactly. But in this case, it's not special effects.
It's the power of God at work.
So it's not enough to just believe in God.
Nope, we gotta connect with him on a deeper level.
Tune our hearts to his frequency.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
so that we can experience his power in our lives.
And his presence, too.
And that connection comes through prayer and worship and reading the Bible.
And obeying his promptings, yeah.
It's like an ongoing conversation with God.
Always growing closer, always learning more.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how this all fits together.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it?
It is, but what about those times when things seem totally hopeless?
Yeah.
Like there's no way out.
That's where transmutation comes in.
Transmutation, what's that?
Remember how the book defines it? It's God's ability to transform something completely.
So like not just fixing a problem, but changing its very nature.
Exactly, like turning darkness into light.
Or making something new out of something old.
Bringing life out of death, that's it.
And the book uses the example of Jesus turning water into wine.
At that wedding feast, yeah.
It's like he took something ordinary and made it extraordinary.
And not just any wine, the best wine they'd ever tasted.
So it's a picture of God's power to take what we see as limited,
And transform it into something abundant.
overflowing with his goodness.
So are you saying that God can do that in our lives today?
Take our brokenness and make us whole.
Absolutely. He can take our weaknesses and use them for his glory.
Turn our messes into masterpieces.
But here's the key. We gotta trust him
Let go of our need to control.
and allow him to work in our lives.
So it's not about us trying to fix everything ourselves,
It's about surrendering to his will.
believing that he can do far more than we could ever imagine.
That's it. It's about letting go and letting God.
This is so encouraging. It's like we're not limited by our circumstances.
Or by what we can see with our own eyes.
There's a whole other dimension at work here.
The spiritual realm, where God's power is limitless.
It's like anything is possible.
Anything is possible with God.
This is awesome.
But there's a potential trap on this journey of faith, something the book calls acclamation.
Acclamation, like getting used to something.
Exactly. And we'll explore that after a quick break.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been talking about how God sometimes asks us to do things that seem kind of crazy.
Yeah, like cutting hair off a cow.
Exactly, and it's all about trusting him, even when it doesn't make sense.
Stepping out in faith, even when it feels risky.
But you mentioned this thing called acclamation before the break.
Right, acclamation.
What is that exactly?
Well, it's like, when you get so used to something that
Yeah.
you stop noticing it.
You become numb to it.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it's about becoming numb to the miraculous.
So, like, we stop expecting God to move in powerful ways.
We get comfortable with a safe version of faith.
A faith that doesn't rock the boat too much.
Right, and we forget that Jesus healed the sick and raised the dead.
It's like we've settled for a watered-down version of Christianity.
That fits neatly into our little boxes.
Without messing things up too much.
Then we start thinking that miracles only happen in Bible times.
Like, God's not doing that stuff anymore.
But that's not true. He's still the same God.
The same God who parted the Red Sea.
The same God who raised Lazarus from the dead.
So, how do we break free from this acclamation thing?
How do we get back to that childlike wonder?
That sense of awe and amazement.
Well, the book suggests a few things.
It's like what?
First, we need to be honest with ourselves.
But where we become complacent.
Yeah, where we've stopped expecting God to show up.
Okay, so taking a good look in the mirror.
Then we need to expose ourselves to the miraculous.
Like, read stories about people who've experienced God's power.
Or listen to teachings that challenge our thinking.
Surround ourselves with people who have that contagious faith.
People who are still believing for big things.
It's like we need to catch that fire again.
Rekindle that passion for God.
This all goes back to cutting hair off the cow.
Being willing to do the illogical.
To step out in faith, even when it seems crazy.
Because that's often when God does his greatest work.
So the question is, are we ready to cut hair off the cow?
Are we willing to embrace those crazy instructions from God?
To step out of our comfort zones and into the realm of the miraculous.
It's a call to radical faith.
To a life of adventure and purpose.
So, what's God asking you to do?
What dream has he placed in your heart?
That seems impossible.
Maybe it's time to pick up those scissors.
And take that leap of faith.
Because when you partner with God,
Anything is possible.
thanks for joining us on this deep dive into cutting hair off a cow
Remember, the kingdom of God is for those who are willing to believe.
and to see God's power at work in their lives.
It's for those who are ready to cut hair off the cow.
We'll see you next time.